Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into one of the most heavily debated, intensely scrutinized phrases in all of biblical history, the Abomination of Desolation. We're going to unpack some brilliant source material that breaks this whole concept down using a fascinating, layered approach. Honestly, if you've ever felt like prophetic timelines are just, a giant, confusing math problem, you are absolutely going to love this perspective. So, to kick things off, let's just ask the massive question that has literally puzzled readers for centuries. What exactly is this mysterious prophetic event? It shows up in Daniel, Jesus talks about it in the Gospels, Paul echoes it, and John weaves it into the book of Revelation. But what actually is it? Well, most modern interpretations kind of treat it like a precise alarm clock just waiting to ring at the end of time. But our source argues that reading it that way, that actually misses the true brilliance of the text. To help us understand, the source material illustrates a really helpful contrast between two distinct frameworks. On one side, we have the popular assumption, which is the single scheduled event. Think of this as a ticking clock, usually anchored to a future 7-year tribulation. But on the flip side, we have what the author calls a layered prophetic motif. In this view, prophecy isn't just a single future alarm going off. Instead, it unfolds in historical waves. It's a recurring pattern that intensifies over time. Okay, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Decoding a prophetic puzzle. 2. Layer 1, the ancient crisis. 3. Layer 2, the Roman siege. 4. Rethinking the future temple. 5. Layer 3, the lawless one. And finally, 6. Embracing interpretive humility. Let's jump right into section 1, decoding a prophetic puzzle. Prophecy as a frame, not a calendar. The authors argue that biblical prophecy is deliberately cryptic, and that's not a failure of interpretation on our part, it's actually a feature of the genre itself. Prophecy is meant to provide a theological frame, not a strict chronological calendar. Think about it like this. Even Jesus' own disciples couldn't piece together the prophecies of his first coming until after the resurrection. Because prophecy is so compressed, no end-time scheme is entirely self-evident. Every single interpretive framework out there has to rely on some outside assumptions to make all those puzzle pieces fit. Moving on to section 2, layer 1, the ancient crisis, the origin in 1667 BC. When we map this out, we can see 3 distinct horizons of our prophetic motif. We're looking at history moving in waves, right? We start way back in 1670 BC, then we jump to the 1st century in AD 70, and finally, we look toward the eschatological future. So instead of a simple countdown to a single scheduled hour, what we're really watching is a repeating pattern of sacrilege and deliverance. So, that very first wave of this prophecy was anchored firmly in 1670 BC. This is the originating layer we find in the book of Daniel. A ruler named Antiochus IV Epiphanes committed a visceral, just horrifying historical act of sacrilege against the Second Temple. He outlawed Jewish worship, he set up an altar to Zeus right smack in the middle of the sanctuary, and he sacrificed swine on it. I mean, it was a literal abomination that caused desolation. And this massive historical trauma, it became the theological template for the future. Section 3, Layer 2, the Roman siege, the primary 1st century fulfillment. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the gospel writers took that ancient vocabulary, the trauma of Antiochus, and totally repurposed it for a 1st century audience who was facing a brand new crisis. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus tells his followers to watch for the abomination of desolation. But check out how Luke translates this for his Gentile audience. Making a huge, decisive interpretive move, Luke reframes the cryptic language into plain historical terms. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. He identifies the abomination neutrally and crystal clearly as the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. And guys, here is the absolute coolest part of this. Grounding this lofty theology in historical reality, early Christians actually used this practical instruction. History tells us that Christians in Jerusalem saw those armies, remembered this exact warning, and safely evacuated to a city called Pella across the Jordan River right before the devastating AD 70 Roman siege. It wasn't just a metaphor for them. It was a literal evacuation plan. But wait, what about the math? I know a lot of popular frameworks tied this event to a future 7-year tribulation based on Daniel's 70 weeks. Well, to neutrally examine this, our source breaks down 2 really viable alternative readings. In the Jeremiah view, the clock starts with Jeremiah's prophecy around 588 BC and runs out just before the Roman period. Then there's the messianic recursive view, where the text isn't a linear timeline at all.
Instead, it's a mirrored structure where Jesus' death renders the sacrificial system obsolete and the Roman general Titus springs the physical desolation. Both of these textually responsible views show us that a future 7-year tribulation simply isn't mathematically forced by the text. Those 70 weeks may very well be in our rearview mirror. Which brings us to Section 4, Rethinking the Future Temple. Does the prophecy require a rebuilt third temple?
This is a crucial point because there's a massive modern assumption that a literal third temple must be rebuilt in Jerusalem for this prophecy to be fulfilled. But the source material systematically outlines some pretty powerful hurdles from the New Testament that complicate that idea. First, Jesus and Paul constantly redirect temple language away from physical buildings and toward the body of Christ, meaning the believers themselves. Second, reinstating literal animal sacrifices creates a massive theological contradiction with the book of Hebrews, which firmly argues Christ's sacrifice was once for all. And third, Revelation 21:22 explicitly states there is no temple in the ultimate holy city. So the text itself kind of pushes back on the necessity of a physical building.
All right, Section 5, Layer 3, the lawless one, the eschatological future. So if the 70 weeks are finished and a physical temple isn't necessarily required, what's left? Let's explore the residual, not yet component of the prophecy. Rather than a ticking clock tied to a specific building project in the Middle East, this future wave points to a figure Paul calls the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 2. This represents a final, highly concentrated incarnation of opposition to God. This figure acts as the ultimate eschatological version of those historical abomination figures we already saw, like Antiochus and the Roman armies.
The Apostle Paul outlines this sequence of events beautifully, creating a single eschatological complex that completely mirrors those earlier historical waves. Step 1 is a corporate falling away from the faith. Step 2 is that culminating concentration of opposition in a single, lawless figure who exalts himself. And step 3 is the grand finale, the glorious return of Christ who destroys this figure with the mere breath of his mouth, bringing the kingdom to its ultimate consummation.
And this brings up one of the most debated concepts in all of Paul's writings, the restrainer. Like, what is actually holding back this final wave of lawlessness? Well, by looking at the Old Testament backdrop of Isaiah 66, the source argues the restrainer isn't some political force. It's actually God's plan for the fullness of the Gentiles. It is the ongoing, active gospel mission to all the nations. The ultimate consummation is currently being held back simply because the mission to bring the world into the fold is not yet complete. How amazing is that?
Finally, Section 6, Embracing Interpretive Humility, Holding the Layers Together.
As we wrap up this explainer, we need to synthesize these epic waves of history into a cohesive takeaway. The most faithful way to read this cryptic, majestic text, according to the source, is to embrace the tension between the already and the not yet. We don't have to collapse them into one thing. The abomination already occurred in the trauma of Antiochus and the 80-70 Roman destruction, which closed the ancient arc of exile. But the not yet definitely remains. We are still eagerly awaiting the final defeat of evil and the return of Christ. I really want to leave you with this provocative thought as we close today. If this prophecy is a repeating pattern of God's sovereignty, rather than a rigid calendar we can just map out on a whiteboard, how does embracing interpretive humility change the way you anticipate the future? Perhaps the greatest revelation isn't knowing exactly when the clock is going to strike, but recognizing the waves and choosing how to faithfully ride them in your own sliver of history. Thanks for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep exploring.